Hi, I'm Renée Walker, a mindset mentor, speaker, and lover of all things spiritual. I believe that at our core, we are all spiritually wired for love, peace, success, and abundance. Here on the podcast, we're diving into mindset, wellness, and business, but always through a spiritual lens. Let's just say we're going deep, but we're keeping it light. So let's elevate your life from the inside out, one conversation at a time. Welcome to Spiritually Wired. Hello and welcome to Spiritually Wired. Okay, today's episode, we are going to dive deeper into a topic that I believe is so important in terms of optimizing our well-being, and that is setting boundaries. Now, I know personally, as a recovering people pleaser, setting boundaries has never come easily. So it's something that I have to be very intentional with. However, ultimately, it is how we protect our energy. And I would say that learning to set boundaries is also one of the greatest ways that we can practice self-love. You know, self-love is always thought of as being taking a nice bath or booking a massage, doing something like that, which is wonderful. But I would say that those are more self-care practices, while as self-love, love is a verb, and so it requires taking action. And to me, one of the best ways that we can love ourselves is to be very intentional with what we allow into our lives. Very intentional with who we allow into our lives, how we spend our time, how we protect our energy, how we protect our space. So boundaries, I think, is so important. And like everything, it's always a process that we learn and that we have to shift and adapt. However, I want to share with you some really practical strategies that you can use to help you in setting boundaries. So, when you think of healthy boundaries, they are really limits that you place around your time, your emotions, your body, your mental health, your energy. And it's sort of like building a fence around you, which is different than building a wall, right? So it's not about building a wall and not allowing anything in. If you think of a fence, you are still allowing for communication and still allowing for entry, but it's a way to respect your space and your neighbor's space. So boundaries help you define and be clear on what you are willing to allow into your space and what you aren't. So your life today, if you think about it, your life today represents to some extent the choices that you've been making along the way. So all of the yeses and all of the nos. So boundaries can be very empowering when they come from the right intention. And I'd say that an important thing to remember is that boundaries are not, it's not about controlling what is around you, controlling your environment, controlling the people around you as much, because we know that that's mostly impossible. And really, it's not what we're meant to do. We can't stop anyone else from doing anything, but we can choose. We have the power to choose what we allow into our space. When you think of choices that you make, there's always a consequence to it. So what I know has been very helpful to me is really realizing how every yes that I say means that I am saying a no to something else. And so creating contrast around the choices that I make. So if I am saying yes to going to an event, Well, that means that I'm saying no to something else. And usually the no that we're saying to is ourselves, or it's the people that really matter in our lives, right? So I can go to that event, or maybe that was the time that the only time that you had for yourself, or you could go for a walk where you could relax. Maybe it was the only time that you could spend with your partner, with your children. So when you start to look at every choice that you make has a consequence, it can help you as well in defining what you want to say yes to, what you want to say no to, what you want to allow, and what you don't want to allow. I really believe that setting boundaries is, again, it's like that greatest act of self-love and compassion that we can do for ourselves. And in the end, the great thing about it is that it helps everyone, right? It helps everyone because boundaries help you stay in your power so that you can show up in your life the best version of yourself. If you don't have boundaries and you're saying yes to everything and everyone else, what happens is over time, inevitably, you start to feel overwhelmed, you start to feel drained, you start to really feel the stresses of all of your external environment. So when you practice and when you're very intentional with setting boundaries, it helps you be in your power and you show up with more of you as opposed to showing up with the depleted version of you. Now, you can set boundaries around anything that leaves you feeling drained or that leaves you with less energy than you did prior to that encounter. So meaning that some people, for instance, will take up a lot of your energy. However, they also give you a lot of energy. So we can't think of it as a direct exchange in every situation because, of course, that's not how it works. But overall, there's a healthy exchange. And I think of, our kids, that's a great example because they will certainly, your kids will take up way more energy perhaps that you receive back from them, but they also, give you a tremendous amount of love, which will elevate your capacity for giving back to them, right? So it's not always a direct exchange of energy from that perspective, but you're giving also to the people because there is a intangible form of love that is coming back to you. And so that creates more of that healthy exchange. So some of the examples of areas that you can set some boundaries are, relationships, certainly people in your life. You could also refer to that, like when you think of relationships as being like that emotional energy, you can set boundaries around time, around your personal space, around sexuality, your morals and ethics, around material possessions, your finances, right? Or another area that you can set boundaries in, technology. So certainly boundaries around the amount of time that you are allowing social media to be a part of your life. Boundaries around work, around food. So there's a lot of different areas that you can set boundaries. So it can be with people, or you can also be setting boundaries with more kind of situations, if you will. So that's like that social media or the food. And I'm going to call those more like self boundaries because there isn't always another person involved, which means that your boundaries are more around your behavior with that so-called thing. So more around your relationship with that thing. Because the reality is that if you aren't clear on what you will accept and what you will not accept in your life, then guess what? It's going to be the other people in your life or the circumstances that are going to dictate how you're going to spend your time. So there's always going to be more things to do. There's always going to be more time to give, more work, more social media, more food, more of everything. And without boundaries, whether you're making these boundaries on a conscious level or not, without boundaries, we end up living in a life that is more reactive as opposed to being more intentional. So something happens, we get an invitation, we say yes. Someone wants something, we say yes. So now our life is more reactive as opposed to being more intentional. Boundaries help you to stay more aligned with your values and with your priorities. So they're going to help you give, they help you give energy to what actually matters to you. Otherwise, you can end up spreading yourself thin and running out of time, space, or energy to do what you actually want to do or what's important. So you're giving your time to the other people and to maybe some events or situations, and then you're left with nothing. No more energy to spend on yourself, your own health, your own relationships that really are important to you, your well-being. Those are the things that end up being last on your list because everything else around you is dictating what you're doing and how you're spending your time. And I'm sure that at some point you can relate to having had that experience. So where do we start? And there's a book by Melissa Urban. It's called The Book of Boundaries. And in the book, she shares some steps to setting boundaries. And so I'm using those steps, but I'm also incorporating some of my own. So the steps would be first to identify where we need a boundary. That would be step one. And this is where I'm adding a step 2, and that is to identify where there is resistance around setting the boundary. Then 3 would be to use clear communication. And then 4 would be to enforce the boundary. So we're going to go into each of these steps. And the first one is that you want to identify where you need a boundary in the first place. So that's how it starts. So we've touched a bit on this already, right? What situations are draining you with people? It can be easier sometimes to know that a boundary is needed because maybe you feel a sense of dread around having to spend time with them or seeing them. So the first step really requires self-awareness and also the courage, or I'd say the willingness to acknowledge that maybe this person or this situation is taking too much of your energy without giving back. Maybe you have a friend where you feel like every time you're with them, you're the one giving, and then you just, end your time with them and you feel depleted because you've not received anything from it. And that can happen in life. And often that can be with the people. It can be people in your family circle as well. So just being aware of the people and the situations that maybe take your energy. And it does require a bit of courage and the willingness to be real with yourself here. Because, when we are setting boundaries, especially with a loved one, it can be very difficult. And I want to acknowledge that. It's not something that is easy, but it can be helpful to reframe it around the sense of how am I showing up in this relationship? And how am I honoring the person that I'm with by continuing to go along as I am because I'm feeling, maybe I'm too afraid of hurting their feelings. And so I keep showing up, but I'm not showing up in my best way because now I'm showing up from a place of resentment or a place of dread. So being willing to communicate with them and to express your feelings and to redefine the relationship, not only does it help you in protecting your own energy, but it can also help them and help the relationship itself. So it's always helpful to consider the contrast. I find whenever we're making difficult decisions, it's like looking at both sides of the choices that we're making. I can stay in this relationship exactly as it is and continue to feel this, resentment, this dread, and over time grow even more and more resentful, or I can set a boundary that's going to respect us both and is going to allow me to show up from a more loving place in the relationship. So that would be more kind of when you're dealing with people. But when you're dealing with situations, there is Dr. Will Cole. I love his content on Instagram. He's a functional medicine doctor, and he has a great saying, which to me kind of sums it up perfectly when it comes to boundaries in situations. And he says, so this is specifically related to food, but we can apply that to everything in our life. Continuing to eat foods that don't love you back is like staying in a toxic relationship, but wondering why you are still miserable. So when, if we're, again, now we're thinking of food, but it's like when you're noticing that you're eating foods that make you feel like crap, and it feels like maybe you're feeling out of control in the moment, just eating this food that does not make you feel good, then this is where it helps to identify that maybe you need a boundary in this situation. So a great boundary would be, I'm going to eat some foods that love me back. But you can apply this into everything that you do. It's like if you know that you've identified maybe that you need to set some boundaries around social media, because when you're scrolling, right, that doom scrolling, and you're sitting and you can zone out and spend so much time. And after that hour of just scrolling on whatever social media platform you're on, you feel drained and you feel overwhelmed and you feel bad about yourself because now you've been comparing your life to other people. That is an indication that you need to set a boundary in that situation, because it's become a toxic relationship in your life. So really pay attention to those areas, to those practices, to the way in which you spend your time that leaves you feeling more drained, because that is where you want to consider setting a boundary. Now, the second step, or the one that, I've added to it, is that you want to check in with the resistance that you have around setting the boundary. So likely, if let's say it's around food, or let's say it's around your social media, or maybe it's around how you're spending your time and all of the, maybe you're feeling overwhelmed with all of the events that you've said yes to, you want to spend some time to be like, okay, where is the resistance around setting the boundary coming from? Because likely you've known that there is a boundary needed in that area, but for some reason you haven't done it. So in those areas where you've identified that a boundary is needed, what is this resistance and what does it look like? What does it feel like in your body? Resistance usually, or will often, show up as fear. And so exploring the resistance means that you are willing to explore what the fear is that you have around setting the boundary. So it can be like a fear of being left out, a fear of rejection, a fear of not being loved, a fear of being the bad guy, a fear of not being liked. Is it maybe not fear, but is it guilt that is holding you back from setting that boundary? Are you doing it out of a sense of obligation? And I heard someone use an acronym of FOG before. So before saying yes to something, it's like check in with FOG. Are you saying yes out of fear, obligation, or guilt? And if so, this is where maybe you need to take a step back and see how you can create a healthy boundary around it. So FOG, fear, obligation, or guilt. Now, it's helpful to know why you're resisting the boundary so that you can move through it, right? Awareness is always key. That's where we get our power. It doesn't take away the fear, it doesn't take away the guilt or the obligation that you may be feeling, but it gives you that perspective that you are saying yes to something out of fear. It is likely when you actually look at it or examine that fear, most of the time it's something that never even materializes. Or, it just gives you the perspective of you're being real with yourself. You're not pretending that you want to do something out of, love. You're being real with the fact that, yeah, I'm actually doing this because I feel guilty if I don't do it. So it's being truthful to yourself. I know that for me personally, I have been really intentional and working on saying more no's to protect my time, to protect my energy. I've been I'm really blessed. There's been a lot of opportunities that are coming my way, which I think are amazing, but it can also be way too much. So one strategy or a boundary that I've been using is to check in and to ask myself, so when opportunities are coming my way, is this a heck yes when I'm asked to do something? Am I actually excited to do this? Does it fit in with my priorities? Is this a heck yes? Am I excited? Does this fit in? And if not, then I know that it's a no, because it's so easy to slip into this, especially for those of you who are on social media, this FOMO, right? The fear of missing out. So this opportunity comes your way and you say yes only because you're like, oh, I don't want to miss out on this. And at the end of the day, it's not even aligned. You know that there are more important things that you need. However, you can easily say yes if you don't have strong boundaries in place. So really asking yourself, is this a heck yes, or is this more of like a no? And where is that resistance coming from in setting that boundary? So that brings us to another important step. And so let's say you've identified where you want to set the boundary. Now you're exploring, okay, why have I not set a boundary yet? Where is this coming from? What is this fear, obligation, guilt, or something else that is showing up for me? The third step is to communicate this boundary, to share the boundary by using really clear communication with either the person that is involved or with yourself. So if you are setting a boundary that is with yourself in terms of limiting, access to certain things that do not serve you. So the thing about boundaries is that they are not meant to be fluid. Yes, life happens and we can change. But when you think of a boundary, it really is a set decision. And that's how they work. The more we allow them to be fluid, then that's when they don't really hold as a boundary, because now it's like, oh, this is a no for me, but if I allow myself, but it depends on the day, it depends on the person, it depends on the time, it depends on how I feel, then you know that it's no longer a boundary. So there is a set decision involved with setting a boundary. It's not really a gray thing, a gray zone, because ultimately that's where we kind of, as I mentioned, just get in trouble when we stay in that gray zone. So remember that yes and no don't have any emotions they don't have any emotions attached to them. So a yes and a no are simply a yes and a no, but they will stir up emotions. So there's no emotions to the yes or the no themselves, but they definitely will stir up emotions in others and perhaps in ourselves as well. There can be some anger, some disappointment, some frustration when we are communicating boundaries. So they require clarity
You want to be clear about what you allow in and what you don't allow in. Brene Brown has this great saying, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. Being clear with your boundaries is going to help the people around you have the right expectations of you, of your time, of your energy. And clarity actually helps everyone because now there's fewer unmet expectations, there's less disappointment on their end, and there's less guilt on your end as well. So when it comes to communicating your boundaries, remember that no is a complete sentence, and there is no need to justify your boundary unless it feels right to do that. And I think that that is so important to say because, we're often like, something is presented to us, we don't want to do it, we've come up naturally with the no, but then we feel like we have to explain and justify why this is a no for us. And just remember, no is a complete sentence. You do not have to justify any decision that you make unless you feel like you want to. And what I also find to be very helpful is to tell people ahead of time. So communicate clearly and let people know. So if you've had a really long day and you're tired, you're exhausted, and you know that you're going to come home and your family is going to want to vent about their day, or you just spend some time with you right away, and you know that in that moment you don't have the emotional capacity, then it's okay to say ahead of time, hey, just giving you a heads up here, I had a really big day, I'm coming home and I just need a few moments in order to settle, and just a few moments to myself so that I can clear my head and I can show up for you in a more loving, grounded way. And I think that that is like the key piece that we forget. We forget to let the people know in our lives what we need. And other people can't read our mind. As much as it seems like it would be so obvious to us, people cannot read your mind. So it's not obvious to them. So take the time to communicate ahead of time so you can set realistic expectations on your energy and avoid these hurt feelings in the first place. And the other thing that I would add is not to be shy to share the fear that you have in the first place. So, if you're like, okay, I know that I need a boundary around this, but now I've identified the resistance, right? So my resistance is that I'm afraid to feel left out, I'm afraid to feel rejected, whatever it may be. Communicate that. The vulnerability piece in doing that is so helpful in terms of deepening the connection that you have with you and the other person. And it also gives them permission to do the same. Now, as I said, no is a complete sentence, so it's not like you have to do this. But in relationships that you really value, you can say, like, I want you to know that I really appreciate and value our friendship, but I've got to be honest with you, and I am just right now being very intentional with where I'm spending my time. And I've realized that I have way too many commitments right now. I've been saying yes to too many things. And as much as I hate missing this, I'm going to have to pass on it this time. By just being real, then the other person is going to recognize and just see like you're genuine, and you're sharing an important part of yourself. And I cannot tell you how many times I've done this where the other person is like, oh man, thank you, because I need to do the same thing right now in my life. So recognize it's an opportunity as well for a deeper connection. So again, it has nothing to do with what it is, but it's more about you, more about your energy, and more about your capacity to show up in your power. And one last thing I would say about communication, and Renée Brown also says this, she suggests using what's okay and what's not okay. So, as an example, Mom, Dad, I love that you care about me and my children, and I'm okay with you worrying about us and wanting the best for us. But what I'm not okay with is you telling me what you think I should do. I need you to respect the way I choose to parent my kids. So that can be if you're in a situation where, you feel like your parents might be offering, let's say, too much advice and trying to control the way in which you parent your kids. That can be a good way with someone that you love. So, and use this in any which way, but what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. And I just think that that's a great tool to use when you're communicating your boundaries. The fourth step is to enforce the boundary. And I would add that it's also to create the environment that's going to support the boundary that you are setting or that consequence. So you want to be clear on how you're going to enforce and support the boundary. What is the consequence if you don't? And again, this is all really good to know ahead of time. So if you decide to set boundaries around social media, well, you're going to have to make a decision. How much are you willing to spend time on social media, right? You're recognizing maybe first how much you're losing your energy, how much you're losing your power when you find yourself scrolling. And now you need to identify, so you've identified the boundary. What is that going to look like? And how can you create an environment that's going to support you? So maybe it's like you need to take the apps off of your phone. Maybe you need to set a timer on Instagram. You can set timers on your social media in case you didn't know, where it's like, okay, only half an hour, 30 minutes on Instagram. So maybe it means something like that. So you want to be creating an environment that supports that, right? Just like if know that at night you just feel like snacking all the time and you know that it doesn't serve you. I'm not saying like you choose what works for you, but if you tend to de-stress at night with a bag of chips and you know that you don't feel great after, you're not digesting it, you feel awful when you go to bed, then that means you need to set some boundaries around it. Well, you want to create an environment. You don't want to fill your cupboards with bags of chips because it's not going to support you. So boundaries around your time may also require you giving yourself a day before you commit to anything. So let me get back to you on this. So making a decision that whenever you're asked to do something, you do not say yes or no in the moment. So now you are giving yourself some time and space to really check in and say, okay, does this align with myself, with where I want to spend my time and my energy? And then you can really be intentional around setting that boundary. So there's a few more truths about boundaries that I would share, and that is that it requires consistency. So if you keep changing the boundaries that you set, then you're confusing yourself and you're also confusing the people around you. Remember also that yes and no have no emotions. It's really just that they can stir up emotions. So yes and no are simply decisions that you're making, choices that you're making. And I also would say that it's really important to know that it will likely feel uncomfortable. You're likely going to feel guilty. You're likely going to feel maybe a bit like the bad guy. It's not easy to do because it's so much easier to say yes and to please the other person. So know that setting boundaries is likely going to feel uncomfortable, but it has the potential to free you up so much, to free up your energy. So remember that contrast that we talked about. So it can feel uncomfortable in this moment, or you're delaying the discomfort to the day in which now you've committed and you've said yes to something because you didn't want to hurt the person's feelings. Now, guess what? The day arrives and now you're doing something that you don't want to do. And that feels uncomfortable too. So there's going to be some discomfort involved, and it's either you're doing it, you're serving the other person or the situation or the obligation, or you're serving yourself, and maybe that's like a delayed response. But keep that in mind, that it's never easy. It's never fun to set boundaries. But at the end of the day, it is about protecting your energy and protecting your power, which is so incredibly important. Because the thing with boundaries is that, as we mentioned, they are one of the greatest ways to practice self-love. And not only self-love for yourself, but love for the people around you. So I would say really pay attention to, where you're spending your time and energy on, what is giving you energy, what is taking away your energy, because it so impacts the way that you feel about yourself and the way that you are honoring yourself. Our life is created in the small moments. So all of the yeses and all of the nos that you say are all the small ways in which we're either compromising ourselves or we're actually fueling and honoring and loving ourselves. So be clear on what's important to you and use boundaries as just a tool to help you stay intentional with what truly matters. So I hope that you find some inspiration when it comes to setting boundaries in your life. And I want to remind you that you are spiritually wired for greatness, spiritually wired for love, for success, for abundance. So until next time, have a great day. Thank you for listening to Spiritually Wired. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow and leave a review. It really makes a big difference for the podcast. And if you're ready to dive deeper and join a soul-led community, come be a part of the Spiritually Wired membership. With weekly live lessons and a rich library of recorded classes, it's designed to support you every step of the way on your spiritual journey. We currently have a special offer where you can receive your first month for half the price. You can find a link in the show notes or come check it out at reneewalkerwellness.com. Until next time, remember to take some deep breaths. Remember that you are spiritually wired.